And thanks everyone for coming along at the end of a really... It's a bit what? Closer. Like this close? I feel quite sinister, slightly sexy and menacing. If I electrocute myself, what a way to go. Anyway, it's been a fantastic day. It's been great to hear your papers. I know you'll be tired, so this is more of a kind of practical talk, really, to discuss my own experiences of trying to think about how we can collaborate better from what I call the different groups of people who work with the material we work with, whatever we call that, esotericism, occultism, and so forth. So it's just over 40 minutes. I'm going to show a short video as part of that, and then there'll be some time for questions if there are questions, and if not, it'll be time for the pub. So let's get started. And I really want to start by thanking Cavan, who I don't think is here, maybe he's out of the room, and Elizabeth and the whole organisational team for inviting me and for making this really, really special event, which is pioneering in the way that it's putting esotericism studies scholars in dialogue with practitioners of various kinds and with artists. And it's really about a similar initiative that I'm going to talk today, which is the Media of Mediumship, as you can see here on the slide, which was an AHRC-funded public engagement and impact project that I, along with my co-I, sorry, let's get a hand there we go. Does that work? There we are. Look at us. You can see that photo of me was taken a few years ago before the lockdown did its work. That I ran with Dr. Ephraim Sarah Schreier and my postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Emma Merkling. It just finished, but basically this lasted for 18 months. And it was a project in partnership with the Science Museum Group in the UK and Senate House Library. And our goal was to showcase and create new artistic works inspired by the scientific occultural holdings at each institution. And as I said earlier, I want to draw on this experience to suggest strategies by which those of us with an interest in the history and creativity of esotericism, which I think is pretty much everyone here, might collaborate more effectively to produce new perspectives on and better understandings of the materials we work with. Thanks very much, Cavan. You missed me thanking you. Thanks again. So how can we better understand the materials we work together by working together and expand our various fields of practice? So as I said, this was a public engagement project dealing with esotericism, and I think probably the first thing to say is that from some vantages, the prospect of engaging the public with traditions and discourses that have, after all, often billed themselves as secret might seem counterintuitive, unwelcome, or even paradoxical. After all, since its institutionalization in the early 90s, esotericism studies, there we go there, has been dominated by an emphasis on the marginality, rejection, deviance, and often subcultural status of the magical and spiritual currents it works with. This tendency is probably exemplified at greatest length in Wouter Hanegraaff's field-defining work, Esotericism and the Academy, which many of you will know, which argues that esoteric traditions have been consistently othered in the West since the Reformation, first by 17th century Protestant polemicists, and then by Enlightenment rationalists in a tradition that has continued until this day. As he writes, although the terms superstition, magic, and occult have long histories, they were essentially reinvented during the period of the Enlightenment in such a manner that they would serve to demarcate the other of science and rationality. And I think it's worth just maybe throwing some scrutiny on that claim, and certainly that's what my project wanted to do. In recent years, this influential paradigm has been subject to a number of important adjustments and critiques, from scholars who point out that although rejection really has been played an important role in modern esotericism's history, right? Rejection by an imagined mainstream that is always moving, it is by no means the only story. It's not the only story we should or could tell about these materials. Certainly in my own discipline of English literary studies, in which occult topics have long been recognized as mainstays of the literary avant-garde and popular fiction alike, and hence firmly on the critical radar, the rejection hypothesis doesn't really make a very convincing interpretive fit. Other scholars like Eagle Asprin and Julian Strube warn that the rejection hypothesis might, when taken as a default setting, drift dangerously from description to prescription in a way that ultimately isolates our field. Okay. Asprin urges researchers to more closely scrutinize, quote, the rhetoric of an oppressive establishment pitted against esoteric underdogs, and its correspondent positioning of existing establishments, notably in religion and the sciences, as not only repressive, but also as dogmatic and simple-minded. That can be a really attractive way to frame some of the traditions we work on, but it's not necessarily always the case, right? So my own concern in this project was less with the potential shortfalls of the rejection hypothesis as a historical hermeneutic, although I do have some concern about that as well. Rather, I was motivated by my concerns about its limitations as a methodological tool. If we automatically assume that mainstream scientific establishments, for example, like the Science Museum Group, have always excluded the history of the cult in order to forge their own authority, what will we be prevented from seeing? What collections and connections will we miss? And what new research will we be unable to do if we always assume that it does not have a presence in these so-called mainstream authoritative scientific sites? The media of mediumship was premised on the conviction that modern occultism, and in particular the material culture of occultism, was already enmeshed within major academic archives and scientific collections, but its role there was poorly understood. Its presence there, sometimes unknown, and could be more widely explained and creatively leveraged for more people, including for the contemporary practitioners of the spiritualist traditions we studied. Even if the wide and mixed constituencies who have a stake in the history and artistry of esotericism do not necessarily share the same beliefs, it seems to me ethically imperative that we, as far as we can, exchange knowledge, and that this is possible and that is worth doing. And that's what this project was about. So let me tell you first a little bit about the origins of the project, which lay in a previous academic research network that I had. I don't know if anyone here know of it. There's no reason why you necessarily would have. It was called Popular Occulture in Britain, that I ran at the University of Glasgow between 2016 and 18 with my colleague Andrew Radford. In that project, what we wanted to do was examine why and how occult ideas, tropes and beliefs entered the British popular cultural mainstream in the years of our study, paying particular attention to their dissemination within things like popular fiction, radio, theatre, political movements and magazines. And what we did for that, we had 3 workshops. We had one in Dublin, one in Birkbeck in London, and one at Glasgow, which had, not unlike what we're doing here today, we had a range of invited speakers, talks by artists, scholars and curators, some within esotericism studies, some not. And then we had important occultural archive visits, which I think is also a really important part of this work, is to try and do site-specific location as far as possible, because that really does change the way that you receive the knowledge and that we work together. So the main output for that was this book, The Occult it's an essay collection, The Occult Imagination in Britain, 1875 to 1947, that came out with Routledge in 2018. So Andrew and I, we were delighted with the range of contributions that we had for this collection, but we also knew that the prohibitive costing of academic books might limit its readership to those with access to an academic library, although you can now get it in paperback and Kindle, so I'm just putting that out there. But I think if we're talking about barriers or impediments to collaboration, certainly I think the costing of academic research and the way that's paywalled is a real problem. The project had generated a lot of momentum, and I wanted to take it forward to more audiences. And also, I really wanted to push beyond my own disciplinary limitations. I am, as Jenny introduced me, I'm primarily a scholar of Victorian literature, which means that most of my research has been entirely text-based, right? And as Trans States, I think, and many other initiatives on practice point out, texts will only get you so far, right? At some point, you have to move beyond that. Over the course of popular occulture in Britain, it had become increasingly clear to me that we can't really talk about occult popularization in the 19th and 20th centuries by attending just to print sources. We need to think also about the material culture and technical media that opened up occult and spiritualist practices for scientific testing and creative innovation alike. And there's been some excellent scholarship on that interface between spiritualism and technology, including by Eric Davis, who is here today. But that hasn't always been reflected in the way these kind of artifacts are curated and displayed in museums, for example. So how do we take that knowledge that scholars in the field are working with and bring it to more audiences? How might the experience of touching and using such technologies have produced particular kinds of aesthetics, kinds of haptic and experiential knowledge and ideological positions? Further, what could we gain by recreating the immersive environments in which some of these technologies were originally used in the 1890s and the 1920s? Where were these period devices now housed? How were they being collected and how were they being curated? So that really was the set of questions that got me going in this project, right? Are these objects, are they marginalized, are they suppressed, are they hidden, or are they in plain view, but their role in this history just simply is not addressed? And now I'm going to talk about well, hopefully quite briefly and maybe not, but potentially the most boring part of my talk for people who are not British academics, which is about the impact agenda. Does anyone know what the impact agenda is here? Sorry, it does. It sounds like a threat, the impact agenda. It's useful to know even if you're not an academic because I think it has implications for the way that you might collaborate with academics, and also because there's funding streams related to the impact agenda. So here we go. First of all, what is it? So this is the impact agenda, by no means uncontroversial initiative that was formally introduced as an assessment rubric within the British academic landscape in 2014 as part of what some of you may know is called the REF, the Research Excellence Framework. It's how we get money from the government basically every 8 years where our research is assessed. When the impact agenda came in, since then, British universities have been required to demonstrate not just that they're producing new research in the traditional forms like peer-reviewed publications or postdocs, PhD students, research grants, but also that our research is impacting on non-academic audiences, right? And not only that it is impacting on non-academic audiences, but you have to be able to document that, to evidence it in a particular way. This is how impact is defined. In the REF, impact is defined as an effect on, change or benefit to the economy, society, culture, public policy or services, health, the environment or quality of life beyond academia, right? So for most of us in English literature departments, some of these parts aren't going to, probably not going to increase anyone's health outcomes. It would be surprising if I did. Anyway, but some of them are achievable. So now to succeed in our regular assessments, we need not just to create, but to measure non-academic impact through case studies that are backed up by hard data, such as survey responses, interviews, audience figures, new products, methods, business partnerships, health outcomes, or even sales figures. And as you can expect, I'm sure you can anticipate, the impact agenda has been criticised by many as an extension of the neoliberal marketisation of the academy, which prioritises income generation over pure research. That's not a surprising critique to anyone who's heard me describe that. After all, not all scholarly research can or should have immediate and demonstrable non-academic impact, or can impact be instrumentalised in these terms. In any case, as we all know, often when you have a practical breakthrough, they're incubated through a long period of experimentation. It's not something that just happens as soon as you decide that you're going to impact someone, if only. Thus far, so those are the critiques of impact, but I will say thus far, I think the way that this has been applied has been sensitive enough to allow for these qualifications. Not everyone has to show that their research is impactful in these ways. And I do think there is a good thing about the impact agenda, and that is that there's a lot to be gained by encouraging academics to connect with audiences outside their usual disciplines. That is not a bad thing. Even if our disciplinary colleagues remain our main reception site. In addition to extending my knowledge base, I know that sharing my research with non-academics has made me a much better communicator than I would have been otherwise, and hopefully a more sensitive one as well. Okay, that part's over. Now on to the media of mediumship. So this was funded by a research stream designed to maximize those kind of impact encounters, the AHRC follow-on funding for impact and engagement. This, in particular case, is kind of somewhat of a closed scheme in that you must previously have had money from the AHRC to apply for it, but once you have, you can apply for this money, and it's a decent sum of money. It's up to £100,000, simply to bring your research to new audiences and to do new things, right? It supports activities that will, quote, enhance the value and wider benefit of your original research project and have a significant economic, social, cultural, or policy impact. Exploring unforeseen pathways and collaborations that arose during the initial work, and enabling a range of interactions and creative engagements between humanities research and a variety of user communities. Again, there's sort of the slightly sinister neoliberal language of user communities, but you know, it does the job there. So the goal of this project wasn't necessarily to produce new research, although it inevitably did, right? It's very difficult to just share without learning something new. Its goal was to accelerate the impact of the original discoveries, and in our case, this meant focalizing the story about occult popularization through the scientific, technical, and entertainment media collections that enabled that popularization. So Senate House Library had been an original project partner, hosting for the network an archive visit to their brilliant Harry Price collection of magical literature. Do people know about this collection? It's incredible. You must go. It's free. It's in the heart of London. It has everything. 13,000 items related to occultism, witchcraft, spiritualism, and psychical research that were left to the University of London by the psychical researcher Harry Price in 1937. Tons of stuff in there. I knew I wanted to work with them. Again, in the past, as I was saying, I'm a scholar of literature. I've mostly worked with print sources, but there is so much more than textual sources there. I wanted to focus on its extensive but less consulted material and audio-visual cultural holdings, which include some of Harry Price and Eric Dingwall's laboratory materials and inventories, extensive collections of spirit photographs, film reels, playing cards, sound recordings. They also have a chair in which Helen Duncan was tied during a test seance. I got to sit on it, but I couldn't get anyone to tie me to it, but it's the next project. So it's amazing, you know, what do we understand about these movements in this history when we deal with objects rather than texts, and when we touch these objects where we are allowed, right? So it wasn't just about the Senate House Library collections. We wanted to put them in dialogue with those of another archive, one not only far less well known for, but seemingly anathema to and exclusionary of occult and spiritualist history. This is, of course, the Science Museum Group. This came up as a project partner. During the previous project, I met my co-I, Ephraim Sarah Schreier, who's a historian of science. He specializes on the connections between 19th century anthropology and spiritualism. He's got just a great book come out about that if you're interested in that. They're kind of the role of anthropologists in creating fieldwork methodology by working with spiritualists. He had been an academic at Leeds Trinity, but at this time he was working in the Science Museum as the research grant manager, which was great. And he let me know just how much stuff there was in the Science Museum about the history of science, spiritualism, which I would never in a million years have suspected. The collections are not just home to Isaac Newton's telescope and James Watts's original 1788 steam engine, but also to the infamous Cottingley fairy cameras used by Elsie Wright and Francis Griffith, the spirit photographs produced by the photographic medium William Hope and his crew circle, the early wireless and radio technology theoretically and metaphorically co-opted by Victorian spiritualists such as Oliver Lodge and William Crookes to explore the existence of an unseen world of spirit, and also basic everyday technical instruments like thermometers, dictaphones, and barographs that were a really crucial part of Harry Price's medium tests. These collections had together a combined significance for the history of science and spiritualism that we sought to demonstrate by showing how they had been used by all kinds of peoples, by mediums, by skeptics, and by creative artists. And we were joined in this by our brilliant postdoc, Dr. Emma Merkling, who's an art historian. When she started on the project, she just finished her PhD at the Courtauld on Evelyn de Morgan, who's a spiritualist artist in the 19th century and abstract geometry and esotericism. See, it's even difficult for me to explain that. So basically the point here is it was a really interdisciplinary team, right? We had a historian of art, we had an English literature scholar, and we had a historian of science. That was really brilliant. I think collectively we were able to see things we would have never seen on our own. And if you are considering a project like this, just from the beginning, try and get as many different specialists or specializations, agendas, eyes in there as possible. So now I'm going to tell you what we did, and with the caveat that what we ended up doing was completely different than what we thought we were going to do, because we proposed this project, and you'll know why, in December 2019. Do you remember back then, the before times? We submitted then a plan of largely on-site and in-person activities, talks and workshops with international speakers. We were going to fly in from around the world, curatorial tours, historical recreations, and live immersive performances. It took us a year to have the project reviewed. We were funded, but my God, the world we were going to do this grant in did not exist anymore, right? By December 2020, oh, sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. Oh no, what's happened now? Can you see? I can no longer see the next flick to the next slide button. Kevin, do you know? I can't. I've just, yeah, it's went to.
Oh, goodness. We're in a different view.
Yeah.
I don't know. We try back?
Yeah. Oh, there we go. It's fixed. You're going to have to watch all the other slides as well now. Sorry. Yes. Just briefly, in case it's useful, if you're working on a project of your own and you're thinking about, okay, how do we phrase what we're doing? How do we set it up? These were our objectives. We said we were going to transform understandings of the relationship between science, technology, popular culture, and unorthodox forms of spiritual belief in modern Britain by showcasing the role that collection materials at the SMG and Senate House had played in these histories. Our activities had been intended to put audiences in close proximity, even intimacy, to collection materials and allow audiences to reproduce or experience their use. Yeah. There we go. Why did we want to do this? Why were these our goals? We wanted to produce and test forms of experience about modern occultism that is unarticulated in written records. What can you learn by, rather than reading a short account of a seance, seeing, well, enduring the length of it, for example, or performing some of the setups the instrumental readings it would have involved. We wanted to stimulate interest in archival objects which may appear static or visually unenticing by recovering their occult histories of use. The materials we were working with, some of them look incredibly boring, right? They just look like old, dead tech, but they had these fascinating stories we wanted to bring to life. We wanted to help users to engage more closely with archives by producing their own collection material if possible, and to give new creative life to materials such as occult sound recordings, which are sometimes difficult to interpret by traditional methods. And as I said, when we got the money, it was a different world, right? We had to redesign everything for the new conditions of the pandemic. This was challenging. We were sorry to sacrifice a number of our international speaker-led events, although some, like the brilliant talk on spirit photography by Shannon Taggart, who will be talking again tomorrow, we were able to do over Zoom. Sorry, Shannon, I've used a photo of you without letting you know that was coming. And in some sense, so of course COVID was difficult. COVID was difficult for all kinds of researchers, but these conditions also required us to think on our feet and develop some strategies that actually really enhanced the project. For example, through the development for our installation, we had a mobile phone, AAR app, sorry, that's what the kids call it, on your phone, that people could do self-guided tours around the materials and really enhance the kind of uncanny effect of that. It's something I would never have considered in the previous plan. After all, the project was in its essence about how people had used technology and communication media to create forms of intimacy with people who were no longer physically present. We too had to develop techniques for touching the past in intangible times. So now briefly on to what we did. We really had two streams of activity, ones that I think pick up on the kind of activities that are being discussed at this conference. One devoted to knowledge exchange and one devoted to the production of original creative works and performances. So there were online talks by myself, Ephraim, and Shannon. Often these were focused on specific collection items. We do flash talks and say, like, look at this. Let us tell you why this was actually used to theorize the way that ghosts might move. And then Emma, this was great. This was really just when the Science Museum was opening up after the lockdown. They have a late night every month where the doors are open. There's all kinds of activities, and our postdoc Emma did short on-site talks on the hidden occult history of the X-ray, which saw over 2,400 people come through the doors at South Kensington for that late night. So it was really great to bring in those audiences. Of course, we did audience surveys for all these events. We recorded the talks. We put them on our YouTube channel. And in the place of the originally planned sort of live curatorial tours, Emma designed 3 brilliant digital exhibitions for the Science Museum Group's Objects and Stories series, each centering on objects from the SMG and Senate House collections, and dedicated respectively to the topics of using science to investigate the paranormal, telecommunications and the occult, and spirit photography and the occult. And you can see them here. And I still get a kind of thrill when I look at these under the Science Museum logo. I think that is perhaps the biggest achievement of the project. It will be surprise to no one here that stakeholders at the Science Museum sometimes expressed anxieties about what we were doing in this project. They weren't always comfortable with highlighting these aspects of their collections. And some anxieties were expressed at the start that we might be implicitly endorsing the spiritualist hypothesis or adopting what some would describe as an anti-rationalist position. So that was quite odd. Even after we'd been funded, we still had people who were like, oh God, what are you doing? Emma and the team worked closely with the public engagement and communication teams at both sites to kind of allay these sensitivities and make it clear that our goal wasn't to endorse, but really just to excavate and uncover the technologically mediated claims about the nature of psychical phenomena made by spiritualist believers and scientific skeptics alike. My position has always been that the enterprise of scientific naturalism is strong enough to withstand an examination of its history, right? Science is not going to evaporate because we talk about its history. But it was, I found, really useful. It was sometimes difficult to deal with these anxieties, but it was always also really useful. I don't know if any of you are in this position, but sometimes as academics, we tend to think things are no longer controversial in the real world because they're not controversial among academics, and it's just not the case. And it was really useful to remember the different status of these kind of claims and these histories for different audiences. So yes, on the Science Museum website, we got occultism there. But this wasn't just about taking digital space at the Science Museum. We also conducted other activities in the physical space of the galleries, such as at the National Science and Media Museum's Kodak Gallery. I don't know if you've been there in Bradford. It's a great space. They have this creepy old Victorian parlour in the basement, which is mostly dedicated to photographic technology. And we filmed a... Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. We filmed a Victorian seance down there. We had Victorian seance in the Science and Technology Museum. Seance, a view through the veil. And a key insight raised again and again by the project was how much site-specific activity can enhance reception of knowledge. And I'll say a bit more about that when I get to talking about Lilydale. The location of psychical research materials and resources within the space of the Science Museum is itself an argument, right? That itself is the fact that you're encountering here says these two connect, they belong together. Okay, second part of the project strand was not about scientific truth claims, but about creative works and artistic production. We wanted to show how technologically mediated forms of spiritualism and occultism had, and continued to do, inspire creative works. In our case, we made, as I said, performance magic, video, radio drama, and sound art. I mentioned Nick and Andy's The Seance Recreation film. There was a family-friendly workshop on ghostly acoustics called What Noise Do Ghosts Make? Ghosts Make at Bradford for kids. And at the University of East Anglia, our project collaborator Richard Hand, who's a world-leading authority on Grand Guignol theatre and Golden Age horror radio, his work's brilliant. He's just got a new collection out of bizarre Grand Guignol plays with names like Orgy at Lighthouse and things like that. So I recommend his work. He wrote for us 3 original radio plays about this fictional psychical detective, Zachariah Yeager, with plots inspired by the fictional holdings in the Price collection, right? So let's not look at just how Price investigated, what kind of fiction is he reading and being inspired by. These were then performed and produced by an international team made up of student and community actors in Norwich, the National Edgar Allan Poe Theatre in Baltimore, and the Hong Kong-based soundscape composer Caesar. And then these were broadcast on BBC Radio Sussex last Halloween. Again, this was another case where the necessity of working remotely actually had a lot of advantages. We would never have had such a wide international team if we decided to do everything on site at Norwich. And everyone involved really had to find ways of working. If they're voice actors, how do you work when you're dealing with delayed recordings and so forth, and create a kind of synergy as if you were in the room together, which in itself, that kind of new practical element represented a valuable outcome of our project. And then finally, our sound artists, Alex Kolkowski and Kit Price, long-running collaborators with interests in early sound and recording technology, produced for us 2 remarkable research-led pieces. The first, Mental Radio, was an hour-long, they called it a radiophonic montage, which I think is an interesting term, consisting of newly recorded sound loops inspired by the archival material on the BBC's famous 1920s radio telepathy experiments. I don't know if you know about these. These were very strange, where listeners were invited to think in and see if they could pick up the signals that were being sent out by broadcasters, and then they would be tested later. That piece worked to both reproduce what it might have been like to listen in to these experiments and to wrest the early records of psychical research, some of which, let's be honest, are quite boring, to take them out of that scientific context and imbue them with a kind of magical incantatory effect. This too was broadcast on Resonance FM. And then the final commission they did for us was called the Laboratory of Psychical Research, a 4-day-long sound installation accompanied by daily live performances held in Senate House's courtroom as part of the last year's Being Human Festival. And the best way to tell you about that is just to play the short video they made about it for us. So it's just about 5-6 minutes. I'll play this now. This is what sometimes happened with the technologies we researched. There was technical problems. So maybe this is a tribute to that. All of our videos and talks are on our project YouTube channel. So if you do want to check them out later, you can. That's fine. I'll just. Okay, so my video and my slides are gone. So it's too bad because I had some lovely photos of Lilydale. I'll talk briefly about that. But if you do know Lilydale, New York, which is the longest running modern spiritualist community in the world, it's been going since 1876, I think. 79, and that was the final thing that we did on the project, was to travel there. There's a brilliant annual symposium that Shannon organizes with spiritualists and academics there, but we'll get to that. So I don't have these pictures, right? So that was the installation. We garnered feedback from it, and just, why is it useful to get feedback from your audiences? Well, there's a really cynical answer, which is because it's what the funding body wants. But the more interesting answer is that it was really interesting to have our fundamental research suppositions and questions altered by the feedback that we were getting, right? To learn that actually some of the things that we took for granted actually were not so. And I mentioned that earlier about the tendency, if you're a scholar of this material, to sometimes think something is no longer controversial that it actually really is, particular parts of this history, or to underestimate the level of public knowledge and interest in these materials. By looking at and working directly with the cultural media, in my case, such as the Cottingley Ferry cameras, we recognize the difficulty, even the impossibility, of cameras serving the evidentiary function that they were so frequently enlisted to serve by all sides on the spiritualist debate. One thing that became really clear as a result of this problem is that when you bring technological equipment into the spiritualist context, it never solves the problem on one side or the other, right? It never does. It only complicates the question of credible testimony. So our project partners also reported gaining new skills, audiences, knowledge, and networks. And all of this really is to say that doing interdisciplinary work, impact-related work with esotericism, is really worth doing, right? If you're not doing this kind of project already, think about doing it. It has a range of benefits beyond academia that can feed back into better and fresher questions and approaches. And now briefly on Lilydale, we just got back from there in July 2022 for the Science of Things Spiritual. Lilydale is an incredible place. If your research brings you there, or if your work on spiritualism, you must go. It's home to approximately 275 mediums year-round. Cue lots of photos of medium signs outside houses, and hosts 22,000 visitors each year. Key local landmarks include a spiritualist lyceum, healing temple, a library and museum, and a beautiful outdoor space where there's regular inspiration stump message services held daily in the summer. They also have an incredible collection of 19th century spiritualist art, which is spread throughout the buildings there. I know for myself, I've so often worked on these materials through the kind of the vantage of historical distance. To see them live and on the wall was really incredibly moving. To get that kind of closeness. We also got some of the richest survey data that we'd had at any of our events so far. I've never encountered an audience academic conferences that knew so much about spiritualist history. And that was really interesting to me. It quickly dispelled any lazy assumption that practitioners and academic researchers must automatically have different interests in the material they study. But it wasn't just spiritualists who were at Lilydale. There were also, surprisingly to me, a lot of writers and artists, novelists and filmmakers who were working on spiritualism and magic projects, and like us, sensed the importance of being on site to really engage with these histories. And I suppose one takeaway from that is that when we do public engagement work, our audiences might not be who we think they are, and they might not know what we think they know, or not know what we think they don't know, and that is really great. I think that's really productive. Final paragraph. Okay. So in closing, let me sum up what the media of mediumship taught us about how to engage the public with spiritualist and occult history, and what lessons it might offer for a forward, outward generation of esotericism studies researchers. First, if we don't automatically start with the assumption of exclusion or marginalization, we might find these histories in some really unexpected places, ones where our own expertise and experience is really valued. Second, that esoteric and occult materials that we work with, whether as practitioners or scholars or performers, can be approached from and by a vast multitude of perspectives, traditions, agendas, and user communities. We can never, no one in this room could ever be able to speak to all of those different groups at once, but also none of us can afford to speak to just one, right? We cannot simply speak to people in our own particular, in my case, discipline. As we seek to diversify our audiences, it's important where possible to include stakeholders in the heritage industries and in the practice communities whose histories we study and for whom our research may have direct implications. Certainly, I know academics in the past can sometimes treat these communities as abstractions rather than as real groups of people who are involved in co-producing knowledge with us. Exchanges of this time require time, commitment, and sensitivity, but they are really rewarding. It's not necessary that we all share the same beliefs about what we study, but it's important that we share mutual respect and a common commitment to the democratization of knowledge. When, as academics, we take esotericism studies beyond the academy, we recognize our work can be mobilized not just within a kind of academic state of the field, as if there's ever a single state of the field, right? But rather that it has different meanings for different audiences who we can engage in productive dialogue with. And from that dialogue, produce new methodologies, perspectives, archival material, and maybe even primary sources for future scholars. Thanks very much. Who's knackered? No, that's a fantastic tip, and I think you're right. Natural history museums are maybe not an automatic go-to for this kind of research, but they, as you point out, they probably have really valuable resources. Places we don't think, mining museums, mineral museums, and the history of alchemy, there's projects there. All kinds of connections, all kinds of archives that have a real role in the history of esotericism, and it just never gets picked up. So that's a fantastic suggestion. I'll check that out. Natural History Museum and Cryptozoology. Do you think they'd let us do a project on that? Probably not. Be great though. Yes. Yeah. Could you give some examples of things that you came across with practitioners that were controversial? oh God, to be honest, the practitioner communities were the most open. The controversies have tended to be with people involved in maybe science organizations. This was before this project, but I gave a talk for a network on Oliver Lodge, right? Maybe many of you will know Oliver Lodge. He was a Victorian chemist and physicist who became a spiritualist. And we did an event like in 2014 at the Royal Institution, and talking about all aspects of his career, his work in telegraphy and radiography, his his networks, his international impact, and there was me doing like 10 minutes about his spiritualism. And at the end of that, a guy in the audience got up and he was enraged. And he pointed at this, he was like, there's a sign on you, on that wall that says Royal Institution, science lives here. And I think that science just died here tonight, right? And I was like, oh my God, I had no idea I had that power. Really? I thought, well, if you think that's killing science, you know, don't pay attention to what's happening with scientific funding because you'll have a heart attack, you know. But yeah, you don't know, right? You don't know till you're with that audience and you hear what people think. Some people go like, oh yeah, obviously that's, and then other people, yeah. It's good. It's good to be in contact with the controversy, I think.
Maybe you should have told them that you've got some people who could contact science.
Exactly. It's like, actually, this is science, yeah. No, I resisted the urge to troll, but it was a strong urge. But yeah, thank you for that question. Any other, or yeah?
Thank you so much. This was a really interesting talk and a really interesting project.
Thanks.
I was wondering if you encountered or engaged with maybe the idea of indigeneity at all in this, and that so many of these, so many of these practices that are still ongoing
Yeah.
are within indigenous communities. So I was just wondering if that had influenced your work.
It's a fantastic question, and it's a really important area for new research. In terms of our project, because we were looking primarily at Victorian scientific instruments in these collections, that didn't become a centre of our project, but we certainly have collaborators who are working on these topics. Serena Keshavji, I don't know, I probably butchered her name. If you know her, she's an art historian at Manitoba, working on the Hamilton collection spirit photographs and looking at how the collecting and archiving of that material relates to sort of indigenous spiritual traditions of contacting and speaking with the dead. And also the question of what it means to be channeling Indian spirits in the 1920s in stolen land, right? So in short, we didn't, but it's really, really important, and I'm beginning to see more and more research in that, and it's fantastic. I can't wait to see. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, Aaron, yeah. 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 Yeah, I guess really it's that we can't have a one-size-fits-all model, right? So when we talk about esotericism, some of it has been rejected, some of it has been embraced, some of it's just been mildly disapproved of, but we could still do the event in the Science Museum. You know what I mean? So it's a range, and it's the same with, we think about the politics of esotericism. It's a very obvious point, so I'm sure everyone already knows this, but you know, this isn't just a story about deviance and subversion. Some esotericism is indeed very subversive. Some of it is absolutely in line with what we might think of as conservative values. So it's really, you know, about being attentive to the fact that it's not simply one or the other, that there's multiplicity. But it sounds like that's something you're coming up with in your research too. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and again, as I said, my bias, I'm a literature scholar, so the idea that somehow occultism has, I'm always on the soapbox about this. People say, oh, there's been no work in literature. I'm like, what are you talking about? We've been working on this since the 1950s. It is not a story of rejection there, but I understand that doesn't apply other places. Yeah. 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 I mean, 100%. Like, science rejects. Esotericism may be one of the things that it rejects, but it is not the only thing. That's what you do, right? And there's not a special status attached to occultism as a particular form of the rejected. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Hopefully. Hopefully we're getting towards a more inclusive science history. Yeah. Thank you. Everyone.